Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar, Creating a Catalog Workflow That Works for You, a Relicura production. If you are new to our webinars, if we've not met before, my name is Rachel Christine Woody. I'm the founder and director of Relicura. I have more than 15 years at this point in archives and museums and cultural heritage organizations. And in addition to being an expert in museum and archive collections, I am a business owner, consultant, author, speaker, and people first advocate. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into today's topic. We'll cover a couple different resources today, and those will all have links in the resource section of the slide deck, and they will be shared throughout this webinar in the chat box. So you'll have access to those links at both times, and then they'll also be sent out 24 hours from now in a follow-up email with a link to the recording. Which leads me to my next point. This webinar is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you in this hour, and the link to the recording will be sent out to you again in 24 hours from now with those links. As we're going through this, if you are joining us during the premiere, please feel free to use the YouTube chat box to add questions, thoughts, or other resources that you'd like to share with the group. And because we are using YouTube, you get all of the typical YouTube toolbar functions and options for viewing, so you can expand the window you are currently viewing in, depending on the device you are using, as well as being able to use the closed captioning provided by YouTube. Also, and before we get into it, just please remember and respect that the content presented here is my own unless otherwise cited, and please just respect that. So contents for today, we're going to cover quite a bit, so I'll do my best to keep pace so that we don't go far beyond the hour of time we have together. We're going to get into the basics of what I mean when we talk about cataloging, because it can cover quite a bit or very narrow depending on the definition you are using. We will take a moment just to address the challenges that I know many of you have present at your own home institutions. We will get into just a little bit the standards that we all need to be aware of and work from before we can get into the catalog workflow. And with that, we're going to build off of the standards and talk about what a catalog guide and training looks like, because again, these are the building blocks to the foundation of what will become your cataloging workflow. We'll get into the basics of what that workflow can look like, talking about building that workflow out and the tools that are available to you to help support the actual functioning of your workflow. We'll do an example of a solo workflow for many of you where you are either a lone ranger or a lone registrar at your institution, or even if you're not the only staff member present, you may be the only one doing the majority of the collections management type work. We'll also get into an example of a team workflow. So when it is more than just you who might be creating or reviewing the data, we'll go into some of the complexity of what that can look like, just so that you have a vision of what each of those workflows can look like. Again, we'll keep them basic, but the principles are there that you can then build off of depending on what your actual unique and at-home institution situation looks like. Finally, we got some great questions for today's webinar, many of which I'll cover some of the basic content as we go throughout, but then I will answer them more directly at the end so that we all have the specific answers we're looking for once we've covered all of the content. So with that, I will get into it. Cataloging. So cataloging is quite a big word, or at least encompasses quite a bit for our field of work. It is the creation and enhancement of data in a database. So creation is pretty obvious. You're creating data from scratch where it didn't exist before. And creating, and enhancing data. So when we use metadata enhancement or data enhancement in our field, that means that the data already exists, but it can be built upon, more specific, perhaps adjusted to fit standards, uh, put into the system more accurately. Basically, something is there, but it could be further refined in order to help better functionality. Also, in our field for museum archives and cultural heritage organizations, setting the data is information about the object, the item, or perhaps the larger collection. So, especially in like an archives type setting, there's a cataloging of the collection itself as a concept and the many different types of collections they can have in there, as well as when we talk about doing more item level cataloging, or for museums, that object level cataloging. And the cataloging process requires creation, review, and publishing of the data. So we're using cataloging to mean the entire process, essentially, starting from that creation of data where none existed before, perhaps that editing or enhancement of that data, the review that should hopefully happen with that data, and then the eventual end point, which for many of us is typically the publishing of data to the online catalog or perhaps to an internal access only catalog. The challenges in place. So for many of us, it has to do around capacity when we're talking about cataloging. And so it can be a little to no staff situation. And for many of you, I know you're not only wearing a cataloging hat, you're also perhaps the executive director of the museum, which also means you're the one that's doing fundraising and membership. So capacity for sure, number one. Another challenge can be the hybridization of staff and volunteers. While it is great to be able to have multiple members of staff being able to help catalog, as well as perhaps a great team of volunteers, the hybridization of the two together can add complexity to your workflow process. Also, and especially with COVID-19 and the many job transitions that have happened during and after, we have seen a lot of staff leave or transition into different positions or different museums, which all cause disruptions to established processes that may have been in place, as well as loss of institutional knowledge. There's competing priorities, of course, especially for those at smaller, more moderate-sized institutions. You maybe have several different priorities that you're supposed to be doing all at one time, and it can be very difficult to try and prioritize cataloging over something else like fundraising or exhibit creation. Also, even if we are able to get into a cataloging project and focus on it, we are usually faced with a lot of interruptions throughout our day. And because cataloging tends to be something that can be fairly easy to be interrupted for versus like conservation on an object, it tends to happen more frequently. So being able to help sort of protect your time and the ability for people to interrupt you can be one of our main challenges. Other ones could be that there's little to no documentation for the process. So this can be particularly challenging if it's more than just you and the process that is in place is only existing in your head for the moment. The challenges related to that is that there's no system for knowledge transfer or training. So even if you are able to get additional staff, maybe an intern, maybe some volunteers, if nothing is written down yet or there's not a mechanism yet for training, that means that it's all on you every time. And so you're spending ultimately more time trying to transfer knowledge or train when it's like a one at a time thing versus having something that can be used at many times but only require your one output of effort. And then finally, standards, metadata, and other complex concepts that can be very difficult to teach, let alone convey to audiences that are not typically within our professional sphere, are not as comfortable with the jargon that we tend to use, let alone all the acronyms. So it can be a very difficult part of our work that is seemingly hard to include other people in for all of these reasons. So we're going to tackle quite a bit of these today with giving you some strategies and tools to work with, but I just wanted to acknowledge that all of these things together can make it quite difficult for us to include more people in a cataloging workflow, which is, I think, part of the reason why this topic is so important for us to cover. Cataloging standards. So I don't want to go too deep with this one because if you're at this webinar, chances are that you already know quite a bit about catalog standards. And even if you don't, that is totally fine. The way I want to approach this section is to give you enough information that if you were to share this with volunteers or with a staff member who's not previously been exposed to the way we talk about cataloging, that this will be fairly easy for them to understand. So while there are many complex topics or jargon that I could be using in this section, I am going to try and use as general language as possible to help show you what that looks like. Because ultimately, if you are including other people in your catalog workflow, you will need to be doing the same. So with that said, when we are talking about cataloging and specifically the standards that we follow for cataloging, it basically boils down to two things, two areas where we need to think about and keep in mind standards. That first area is standards that tell us what field or which fields to include. The second area is standards that tell us what required data format should be in those fields. So it's the standards as a whole, and it doesn't matter which standards you may be following. You need two things. What fields am I using and what am I putting in those fields? That's the takeaway. This little snapshot is for everybody who really does love the acronyms and the jargon. And if your brains love that, this slide is for you. If your brains do not love this, you can tune out for a second. You're not going to miss anything. It's just putting together a grid to help explain the schema and the descriptive standards. So across the top row here, we have data schema. And so that's one of the jargon words we use to talk about essentially the framework of the records we create. And across that top row, we've got a box for libraries, archives, and museums, because each field, of course, uses at least one or more different types of schema, depending on the system, the collections management system that they're using. And so with these, I have labeled out what the top 2 or 3 are in some cases. For many of you, the most familiar will perhaps be the Dublin Core schema or the categories for descriptive works of art. So depending on if you're more museum or if you're more archives, those are the two big ones, at least statistically, for your fields. On this bottom row is the data content or the data descriptive standards, and those are typically the standards that are telling us what we need to put in the fields and how. And so again, libraries, archives, museums, we each have our own little boxes. The two big ones for us, if you're in archives, it's going to be describing archives, a content standard, otherwise known as DAX. And if you're a museum, then it's typically cataloging cultural objects, or CCO. So that's all to say, you may hear me say these words or acronyms again maybe once more, but otherwise we don't necessarily need to teach this to people that are outside of our professional sphere. They can still contribute and work in our workflow without needing to know any of these acronyms. So I'm sharing them with you so you can see the connection, that you don't necessarily need to have your volunteers or interns understand what Dublin Core schema is, for example. All right, so to reiterate from that grid, Dublin Core or similar schema, it doesn't necessarily have to be Dublin Core for you, but whatever CMS you're using, it's going to use some type of schema, which will let you know what fields are available. And the descriptive standard, and so the CCO or DAX, whether you're museum or archives, that tells us the descriptive standards, which is what goes into those fields, what format, how it's entered in terms of that format. So going back to that first slide, it's the two things, right? It's the what fields are we using, and then what are we putting in those fields / how. The standards that you end up choosing, so if you're a museum or archives that hasn't necessarily been intentional about the standards that you're following, I encourage you to take a moment and explore those standards, or don't. Go ahead and just choose DAX or CCO if you're an archives or museum. Statistically, those are typically the most popular. Once you know what those standards are, you will then have an understanding prescribed by those standards of what fields are required, what fields are recommended, and then what are considered like the value added fields, or like a use as appropriate kind of field. And the CMS that you use will have all of these fields available and so much more. So working with the CMS and figuring out, okay, is it a one-for-one match, like object name has an object name field in the CMS, or is there a slight variation? Because of course, every museum, every CMS collections management system that is out there does tend to vary the name slightly for their different fields. So while the name may not match exactly, there will always be a field to match up to, assuming that you are using a CMS that was built for museums and or archives. We're going to just dip into the concept of crosswalk. And the main reason I want to show you this grid is so you can see that standards translate into a field in a CMS. And then I want to show you how you can take that concept and start putting it into a process guide format. So taking those complex topics, taking the jargon and the acronyms out of it, and starting to construct an actual catalog guide. So the next 3 slides that we're going to go through are grids, and down the left-hand side are the different fields that we typically see or talk about. In this case, I have Dublin Core in this far top left for an example of the schema. I've got the DAX content standard as well as the CCO content standards in the next 2 and 3 columns. So you can see how the standards compare to the schema. And then I've chosen Past Perfect as the CMS to see, okay, in a CMS, what is that field actually called that I'm supposed to put this information into? So again, you don't necessarily need to know what these concepts are. I don't necessarily need you to understand what the difference between the schema or the descriptive standard is. All I want you to take away from this grid is that if you're looking at standards, for example, if I want to talk about like object title and I want to understand if it's a museum object title, I can look at CC&O. I can look up chapter 3.1 if I want some more details or examples on the standard. And then I can see in Past Perfect, I have the option of both the object name field as well as the object title field. So as you go through these, and especially as you get more familiar with, okay, I know that in these particular standards, I'm going to follow CCO and I'm using the Past Perfect CMS. I know how these fields match up, even if they're not called the same thing. I know where I'm supposed to put these things. You will notice as we go through each of the grids, and as you look at the slide deck later, there may be blanks where there's something available according to that particular standard that may not have corresponding schema or perhaps area in Past Perfect to put it specifically. That is fine, that happens. And in which case, if it's an element that you did want to incorporate, Past Perfect or many of the other collections management systems have different fields that you can take and customize to capture that unique to you type data. So here's the third and final slide. Again, just pointing out the Dublin Core field names that are on the left-hand side, the way those fields or areas of the catalog are referred to in the different DAX and CC&O standards, and what fields those literally translate into, in this case, into the Past Perfect CMS. So again, more of a reference point. Don't necessarily need you to understand all of it, but If you're a brain that needs to see the full picture and understand how the Dublin core fields actually relate to the standards and how those actually relate to your CMS, this is how you do it. All right, so you are not going to give your volunteers or even your staff members maybe that grid to try and decipher and to use as instructions. It is not helpful. It is merely a reference point for them to go and be able to learn more things or to see what fields those are typically tied to. We need to translate that as people who are in charge of or overseeing the cataloging that's happening. We need to translate that into general language and into instructions that are actually understandable. So, as an example, I've taken a mock-up title section where it talks about the title field and what the job of that field is. It mentions that in this case, it can be intimidating for some people's brains to try and come up with a title. So I've provided prompts. What do you think about in this example? If we're trying to give a photograph a title, what are some of the questions we need to answer that could help inform that title? I then give examples of actual titles that could be given for a particular photograph, and I've included a potential impact section. This you do not necessarily need to include in your instructions, but it tends to help people cement their understanding of each area if they understand why it is important and what it could impact if they either one, don't do it, so they skip adding a title, or if they rush or don't spend much thoughtful time on it and just, for example, maybe just name it like a farm in Oregon. Well, that is very limited in its helpfulness. And if they're not understanding the impact of that fairly broad title, then they're not necessarily going to think about or put further effort into it to make it a better title. So if you have time and as you start working on instructions or perhaps revamp or revise existing instructions, I do recommend trying to add in at the very least some examples and explaining why the field is important, what impact it could have if it's not done properly or at all. All right, a note on standards before I have us move on. It is not necessary for your team to learn or understand schema or any of the other complex topics or concepts that we talked about related to cataloging. It's important to know that they exist because they're going to help our foundation for our workflow, but we don't need them to have like a graduate level understanding of metadata and all of the various different schema and descriptive standards that we could follow. And they just need to know what information is needed, how to form it, and where to put it. So building on that concept of what data, what do we need, where are we putting it? All right, now we're transitioning, we're taking that knowledge, we're going to start putting it into guide format and talk about training and what that can look like. So for the catalog guide, when we are thinking about putting something together, and especially if it's for somebody or a team of somebody who doesn't necessarily have the same level of knowledge as you do, we need to make sure we're using common or general language. So I don't necessarily want to see you include schema, metadata, words that are going to have very specific technical meanings that are not going to help your core audience, in this case, your team, and may actually serve to intimidate or overwhelm them. So I want you to take a step away from that language and break it down into more general, user-friendly type descriptive language. Also, we need to make sure we break this down into a step-by-step process. So especially when we're including and using a CMS, we want to break it down to each click. So each point at which you would click a button or click into a menu or select something from a drop-down, we need to know where you're going on the screen and what you are doing. As you go through that, providing real life examples, so actual in your CMS and items that have been cataloged, and take screenshots to help illustrate each concept. So having the text instructions step by step of where to go, paired with a visual that people can use to help just quickly and visually identify, yes, I'm in the right spot, or no, that does not look at all like what I am looking at. Let me back up. That helps them to build confidence to know that they are on the right track. And if they're not on the right track, they know right away and they can go back up to the previous step and figure out where they went astray. Then create training materials in several modalities with the easy to follow guide that they can reference during work. So in addition to the probably written instructions that you will be creating, I recommend recording a webinar that actually walks people through the beginning to end process of whatever cataloging it is you're asking them to do. For many of us, it will probably be the cataloging of an object or an archive item, beginning to end of bringing in that item, accession record, all the way through to completion of that process. In other cases, you may have volunteers helping with research requests, so it may be a different type of record or data, but this particular catalog guide concept can apply to all of those different aspects of the cataloging. Tips for training. So once you have created that written guide, and perhaps you've even done some recordings of walking people through start to end with that guide, training people in real time can be very effective. And I recommend doing it at least once with your staff members and volunteers. As you're going through training, I recommend being consistent and modeling the behavior you want to see. When we're in training mode, it can be very tempting to sort of shortcut or sort of stop short of doing and actually executing the real thing. And that can be very difficult for volunteers or staff to extrapolate out to what it should have actually been or what you should have actually done. And you run into the danger of perhaps the staff/volunteers picking up the wrong behaviors from your training because that is what they literally saw you do. Provide hands-on examples to help illustrate your point. And when we're talking about collections management systems and the act of cataloging, I recommend having them drive as you go through the training process. So drive in this case is having them at the computer, at their laptops, etc., going through the actual catalog process with them in the catalog and doing the driving of the mouse. When you're introducing a new activity, be clear on how the work should be done. And crucially, what is the final outcome? What should that look like? So it's not quite enough to know I should be putting something in this field. It's going to be much more effective and successful if they understand what it should look like when they're finished as well. I recommend providing an estimated time to completion and highlighting any deadlines. This is particularly important if you're working with staff, but it can also be very helpful when you're working with non-staff. It helps them get a sense or a gauge for how long should this be taking me, and if it is taking longer, maybe I need to check in and get more help. Or if it is taking shorter, maybe I want to reflect on, like, am I doing all of the parts of the process or did I miss something? So either way, having that gauge to know, like, did that take me about as long as it should have? Was it shorter or longer? And in which case, what sort of help may I need because of that? And finally, that bigger picture view of how the activity that they're doing will feed into either another subsequent activity or some sort of bigger picture for the project. It can be so easy when we're cataloging to just assume that everybody else understands the magnitude and the impact of that work in an aggregate. But when we're working with staff that are perhaps newer to the process or volunteers who may not have the concept in place of what this impacts, the importance of access, the increased ability for collections management, All of these are important to describe and paint that bigger picture with, because it helps give everybody else a sense of how that work, their work, fits into that bigger picture. Continued, I want you to think about the concept of scaffolding, which is teaching new parts of the cataloging process to create discrete, easy to achieve tasks or areas that can then build on each other. So especially if you're teaching people who have never looked at or used a collections management system before, sometimes breaking this out into chunks and teaching just a core concept like 1 week before we move on to the next week is a great way to help break up, especially perhaps for volunteers that are just not as comfortable or familiar with the process. I recommend also creating a patient and safe environment that encourages people to ask questions and to know it's okay when they make mistakes and that mistakes are fixable. For the most part, as long as they don't have delete abilities in your CMS, everything else that they do in that system, if caught early enough, should be fixable. And it is even more effective if we teach them how to fix it. Not only does that make your job easier later on because they can fix their mistakes when they find it, but it also helps make your job easier in the review process too, because once they learn that mistake and how to fix it, the chances of them making that mistake again and needing you to, one, catch it and then two, fix it is going to decrease dramatically. Finally, I recommend scheduling regular check-ins to review the work done, answer any questions, and discuss next steps. You'll find that as you introduce people and do the training early on, they may need more frequent check-ins, and I recommend pacing that at the rate that they may be entering new records or editing records. So for example, if a staff member is in there every day and cataloging every day, the check-ins may need to be as frequent as every day for the first week or two. Or if they're volunteers and they're only coming in once a week, it can be very easy to forget and sort of lose confidence in what you learned last week. So while you would only check in with that volunteer the once a week they come in, you may need to do that for the next 2 months of them coming in that once a week. So you're going to have to gauge it or throttle it down to what is the bulk output that that person is doing and what is the frequency and where is their confidence level in what they're doing. And then you can sort of pull back on the regular check-ins as you see appropriate. Okay, so we've covered standards. We have covered the concept of creating a guide, talking about effective ways of how to train people, especially in concepts that can be quite complex. And now we're going to start getting into the workflow piece. I'm going to talk about 2 templates. The first template is the template or templates plural that can come with your collections management system. I recommend reviewing what is available in there. Sometimes they come preloaded, other times you have the ability to create your own or even both. Regardless, if you have an option to have at least one template in your CMS, I highly recommend relying on it, especially if you have a team of other staff members with access to your CMS. Many of our collections management systems now also offer pop-ups where you either hover over the field or maybe there's like a gear icon next to the field where if you hover or click, it will pop up with a description of what is that field typically used for, and may even provide a specific format of how the data is supposed to go into that field. For some of the collections management systems, that's pro forma, depending on what the field is, because we have standards that we all use. And or you may be able to edit that pop-up or add your own text to the pop-up to explain what you're using that field for and what the style guide is according to your guide instructions that you created and solidified in the previous sections. Also, in the CMS, you can utilize any options to mark fields as required. This is if there's a template concept and a pop-up how-to concept, there will usually always be the ability to mark fields as required fields, especially if you're creating a new record. And before you can save it, you need to put data in at least the accession number field and like the object name, for example. And you can create an example record that can be referenced. So when you have a template, I also recommend creating a sample record that is clearly identified as a sample versus a real record, so that people can always go and check that record to see how data shows up and where compared to what it is that they are actually entering in to their own records. Okay, so if you don't have access to the CMS templates or you're not as comfortable using them, whatever the reason, we can also use Spreadsheet as a template. Spreadsheets can be incredibly helpful for a number of reasons. First of which is that if you use a spreadsheet that matches up to the fields that are in your CMS, you can often import and then bulk create new records, or maybe even bulk update existing records depending on the CMS that you have, because we're all using standard fields. Even if you can't do that, spreadsheets are still very beneficial. We can do a copy paste of the information. As you can see, the spreadsheet grid that I have across the bottom here, we have the different fields across the top, and then we can match up the data from those fields for each of our entries. Also, putting things in a spreadsheet format and then having each row be a record entry allows us, as the people who are in charge of this process and probably the one that's tasked with review, to be able to review the data all together as a whole. And being able to see all the data at once helps you identify very quickly where are there fields that are repeatedly being skipped, where are the fields that are definitely not following a correct format or that have some sort of other data issue with them. And it allows you to compare between the different records of maybe there's a set of objects that should all have some similar descriptive data, for example, or even shared subject tags, for example, for the set. We can see, okay, where the subject tags consistently applied. Did the description include this additional information? We can compare that all together in the spreadsheet format. So from the review perspective, very helpful. And from the cataloger perspective, if I'm the person putting this together as the cataloger, and once I do like one object from that set, I know that I can very easily copy paste the subject tags for like the next dozen or so of those objects that I'm working on. So it can also help economize some of the effort that the catalogs are doing too. So many reasons why I'm a fan of the spreadsheet when we're talking about setting up templates for this cataloging workflow. Okay, we're going to break out, I think it's 5 or 6 steps for the workflow concept. There could, of course, be many other steps you would want to add to your own particular workflow. Those will depend on your setup, your CMS, how many people you have involved in your process. But we're going to cover at least like the foundational building blocks of the workflow so that you have a picture from start to end of what it should include, and then you'll have space where you can add your own. So first part, select the items that you intend to catalog or that you want your team to catalog. Focusing on one area of the collection tends to be more efficient because if there are shared data points for those items, the likelihood of them being able to be cataloged consistently is increased when they're done together. 2, the second part of this workflow, the person who's doing the cataloging is going to need to do some level of research or looking up or gathering of information about the items that they are cataloging. So this could be from the accession files, this could be some research from related archival materials that came with the items, depending on the items, priority, time you want spent, etc. There will be some amount of information gathering to create data for the catalog record. 3, they'll want to fill out the catalog template or spreadsheet, whichever one you choose, by providing the information in each of the fields that they understand are required. 4, ensure the content in each field follows the outlined standards from the catalog guide. So for step number 3, it's what fields are we using. For step number 4, it's what are we putting in those fields and how. Step number 5, review the work completed and check for spelling errors, typos, or incorrect information. If you're doing cataloging through using a cloud application, which many of them are now, your browser typically offers auto spell check, for example. And if it doesn't, then you may want to consider using a spreadsheet to do the spell check on the spreadsheet before adding in that data entry into the catalog. And then finally, if not already inputted into the CMS, so if the catalogers weren't already directly putting data into the CMS, they will need to, or you will need to do some sort of upload or transfer of that data from that spreadsheet, presumably, into your collections management system. Okay, so with those 6 foundational pieces, we're going to talk about workflow building and tools. When we're talking about building a workflow, the first thing we need to think about is who is involved and what roles do we need in our particular workflow from start to end. So one person could take on many roles, but we want to make sure we have those identified and who is taking on which of those roles. We want to outline what that start and end point is and all the points in between for that workflow for the cataloging process, and which role is involved at each of those points in the process. We want to think about what a trigger event is, and what I mean by that is what sort of event or achievement or activity will trigger the next step in the process. And identify the quality or review checks in the process and how those will be conducted. Most likely the when part is answered because it's going to be after they create the data, but before you publish it. In terms of the who, though, you'll need to identify who and how. For tools, in your collections management system, you may have the concept of tasks, notifications, or even supported system workflows for the more robust CMS options. If you don't, you may have access to project management software for the museum at large. And even if the museum at large hasn't adopted project management software, there's project management software out there you could use if it makes your heart happy. It may be as simple as relying on email to help with the lack of notifications in the CMS. We can do our own notification system with email. And we may want to consider document sharing and collaboration sites if one does not already exist at your museum or archives, even using something like Google Drive or Dropbox or OneDrive to be able to put centralized spreadsheets, for example, for multi-member cataloging can be incredibly helpful. So these are all tools to be aware of that exist or to check out if they exist for you and for you to explore and see which ones you may want to use. Okay, putting it all together, thinking about an example of a solo workflow first. And this is going to be the foundational building blocks only with the concept of start and end. And we're going to read this from left to right. So our starting point is selecting those items, right? And we want to remember to select a small set that can be completed in a short amount of time. And this is particularly true if you are wearing a lot of other hats, because you don't want to have to try and keep track of where you are in the midst of cataloging hundreds of items. Next part of the process is gathering that information. So checking research, accession files, provenance, etc. We're then going to create that data in a record template. So whether for you that means using a CMS template or using a spreadsheet, essentially you creating data and wherever that places for you. You will want to review your work after every 12 entries or 1 hour or any sort of interval that makes sense to you. Again, keeping in mind that you can elongate the frequency of these reviews the more comfortable and confident you are getting into the flow of cataloging. And then if the data was created in a spreadsheet, being able to import that data, if that's allowed in your CMS or otherwise translated through copy paste into the CMS, will be the other part of your process. Now, because this is solo workflow and it's assuming that you are the only one who is creating and reviewing this content, you do not have that additional piece of the outside person reviewing. You are the reviewer. So this particular workflow from start to end is a complete circuit, and you would do like a rinse and repeat for each batch of selected items. Now for team workflow, it of course gets a little bit more complex. I've created what in project management land they call swim lanes. So very roughly, we've got 3 swim lanes. We've got staff member number 1 swim lane at the top. We've got us over here, we're the middle swim lane. And then down at the bottom, this row 3, we've got staff number 2 and their own swim lane. So this is assuming that it's you and then 2 other staff or volunteers, 2 other not you people for your project. And of course, the more people you have, the conceivably more swim lanes you could add to your workflow. But to start with a little baby team workflow, these are our swim lanes. We will start with the selection of items and having you assign those to the team members. And so there's going to be some sort of trigger event where you select those items, and that trigger event is to let that staff member know, I've selected these items, please go and catalog them. What this looks like in terms of, are you using the CMS to send them a notification? Are you sending them an email to let them know? Are you adding it to project management software that this is their next task? Any of those are appropriate, but choosing one and being consistent will be the key for you. So if you're not doing any of this currently, I would suggest exploring and then choosing one and then being consistent so that your team can anticipate and know what they should be looking for when they receive these trigger events. All right. Additionally, as we stay in the you swim lane, I recommend creating a shared document to track where staff are at. So if you are not using project management software to track the entirety of this, which is not as typical in museum and archives land, creating just a simple shared document of what items you've assigned to who and have them enter in where they are at with each of those can be incredibly helpful to help keep tabs on who's done what, especially if something comes up where one of the staff members maybe gets sick or somebody leaves. You at least know where things were left at, and it's accessible by you and other people. And then we're going to go ahead and pop out to the top and the bottom swim lanes. We're going to check in with the staff members number 1 and 2. They've received those object lists from you. They're going to gather information and they're going to start creating data in their record templates for each of those objects. When staff member 1 and 2 are done, or team member 1 and 2 are done, there needs to be a follow-on trigger event to let you know it is ready for review. So again, whether that is using the CMS to use notifications, whether that's using project management software, whether they are sending you an email, when they are complete, that is the trigger event, and they need to let you know that it is ready to be reviewed and provide feedback on. And once you have done that, we can start either importing that data into the CMS if it was in a spreadsheet, or if you were reviewing because it's already in the CMS, you can hit publish. So whatever that last step of the process may look like for you will be on the end of this workflow. So as you can see, the Workflows contain the same foundational steps. They've just been broken out across multiple different people. So as you add more people, it may look a little bit different, but all of these foundational pieces should be in place. There should be different trigger events identified where it's from one person and somebody else needs to do something next, and how you are going to communicate that, whether that is the next step or having your staff track where they are. Both cases we need to have documentation for. So when it is more than just you, it's a little bit more to think about in terms of systems to help support your workflow, but it does make it so much easier once you have those steps in place. Okay, now to your great questions. Number one, my challenge is that I work for a university and my staff has varied experience and changes often. So ideas for how to track where things are and to check quality without it taking all of my time would be appreciated. Yes, so I think for this particular question, definitely prioritizing how you want to manage what that workflow process looks like and how often you may want to review the work depending on who it is and how familiar they are. And in this case, like using the spreadsheet method, even if everybody is in the CMS, can help make your job so much faster and more efficient because you can review multiple entries at the same time versus having to click through each entry and review them in their entirety versus checking like each field and having hyper focus for that one field across all of the records, for example. So yes, strong documentation just because the staff is changing and experiences are varied. So using that general language documentation and then having that piece to help support letting you know when things are ready to review and in a format that would make it easy for you to review and not take up additional time. Question: how do I combat the "we've always done it this way" attitude when I'm trying to encourage the creation of consistent quality data? So this attitude it can be pervasive. So just know that you're not alone in that. And part of combating is sort of providing more information, right? So this is where that bigger picture piece may come in providing, why are we doing it this way? Well, as a profession, we have standards that we follow, and that means what fields we use and how we use them. The reason why it's so important that we share these standards, that we use the same fields together, is so that things can play together more easily and people can find things more easily if you ever did want to contribute to like a collaborative portal. For example, Digital Public Libraries of America is a collaborative portal where multiple collections from many different organizations can contribute their data. And the only reason that they can do that and provide a cohesive and effective user experience is because everyone is using the same fields in the same way. So while I can definitely appreciate and honor the "we've always done it the same way" concept, there's a reason why that is no longer our goal and why we want to change. So hopefully that helps with the convincing. Sometimes it's deeply rooted, so I definitely understand that it can be quite challenging, but I do hope that that will help with providing sort of that importance piece to it. Question: how can I help ensure the workflow is being followed when I experience constant interruptions to my work? Yes, this is so true, especially in our field. And because cataloging can look like we're just like on our computers, we have gotten, as a culture, we've gotten to the point where when we are on computers, we are interruptible versus when we're doing something perhaps more tactile, like putting an object back together, putting an exhibit up. It's harder to let people know that we are not interruptible. So when we're thinking about this, some of the supports can be creating that documentation piece. So like if you're the solo worker, creating that list of the select objects you're working on and then tracking. I love color coding. So if I'm on my spreadsheet, the entries that I've done, I have filled with gray. And the entry I've left off at, I've highlighted in yellow. That way, visually, I can very easily see, okay, which record did I leave off at? What field was I in? And then I can pick it up, whether it's like 5 minutes from now or several days from now. When you're in a team setting as well, that can be helpful, especially if one person's going to pick up after the other for various reasons. So having that documentation and having people visually indicate where they've left off can be incredibly helpful when experiencing interruptions. Question: when launching a new CMS that has tasks and workflows available, how do you train your staff to use those modules instead of the various project management tools they are used to? Good question, because it can be hard enough getting staff to even just use the project management software. So it's one of those where like you want to respect and make sure they're still using that in other areas that they may need to, while at the same time still having the need and want to use of the CMS tasks and workflows. In this particular case, I would recommend having a discussion of how that is so helpful and why it is so important. You can show them the workflow diagrams that we looked at a little earlier and the concept of trigger events and how we let people know when they need to do something next or when we've finished doing whatever our something is, and that is happening in the CMS. So I think framing it in the why is it important, how is it helpful, and if you're the person in charge of this process, just with the decree that this is where it is happening. For various reasons, they may want representation in their project management section that they are doing this work, but the concept of actually notifying in tasks, you need to happen in the CMS. So it may take some encouragement, but hopefully also some of that explanation and context can also help with your case. Question: how often do you audit new records being created and provide corrections in the fields? Oh, if the fields aren't being used or used correctly. So I definitely recommend performing the audit frequently in the beginning, and especially if it's with team members who have not done this type of work before. You will typically pick up on a pattern of where they are struggling or where there are areas where there's some gaps in knowledge or maybe some gaps in confidence for them. And being able to take a look in that spreadsheet format will help you with that. As you go through these and as you set up the workflow, the trigger events as well, like having them let you know when there's a set of data ready for you to review, and keeping those sets pretty small at first in terms of quantity will be very helpful for both of you, because it will help you catch any mistakes they might be making early on and get corrections in place for it, so that as they go through, they're not creating the same mistake hundreds of times, because they don't want that and you don't want that. So very frequent in the beginning, and then you can start pulling up and pulling back afterwards. All right, resources. So we talked a little bit about training documentation, how to create it effectively, and how to provide training that is more impactful and easier to remember for especially our volunteers. I have a specific webinar on this, on how to attract and train the best volunteers. So if you want some more strategies and support around that, I recommend checking out that webinar. And if you are interested in that project management piece, we have a project management webinar that goes into how to leverage project management software and some different strategies around that. So two different webinars you can check out if you're wanting more information. We talked a little bit about standards today, and for those of you who want to go check out or even reference the standards that we talked about, I have the Dublin Core Schema standards set linked at the top, and then I've got the Describing Archive standard and the Cataloging Cultural Objects standards. And then the bottom resource there, created by Jen Riley, is a glossary of metadata standards content, and it has like every standard under the sun currently in that particular document. So if you're not using any of the standards that I happened to mention today, don't worry. It is still totally acceptable to use different standards, and that particular document may be very helpful for you. And finally, keep in touch. Please feel free to reach out via email or check out our website for more information. We'll stay on for a few more minutes to take on any other questions or continue any other conversations we're having in the chat. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending today, and we'll see you next month.